Somebody asked my opinion on another video. Is there significance to Eve eating the fruit first, sinning first in the garden? Because in Christian theology, there is, it's First Timothy 2, where it says Adam was first formed, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. And so, basically he doesn't allow women to teach because the woman got tricked in the garden, and, that brings its own set of problems with it. Now, that's First Timothy, probably not actually Paul, but whoever wrote it didn't want women teaching, and it's because the woman ate the fruit in the garden first, right? So that's kind of, and of course, different Christians have different views, but that's kind of the Christian take on it. In Judaism, I went ahead and read the Chumash, the Art Scroll Chumash. The Ramban actually, it's interesting because they have a much different view on it than Christianity does, as they do with a lot of things. And I was looking at the notes on Genesis 3:13, which of course is a verse which says, "And Hashem God said to the woman, 'What is this that you have done?' The woman said, 'The serpent deceived me, and I ate.'" And the notes on it says, since the commandment was given only to Adam, why was Eve punished? The Ramban explains that Eve had been included in the prohibition since she was a part of him, bone of his bones. Additionally, she was punished for misleading Adam and causing him to sin. That was a greater sin than her own eating. So, there are a lot of views in Judaism. There's rarely one set view on any topic in Judaism. But on this particular one, the woman deceived the man, I guess, and that is what it is. I'm not a fan of either of those views. That's not what I'm going to be expressing here, but I'm just throwing that out there. Now, an interesting thing is if you back up to where when Adam eats the fruit, the note on that in the Chumash is, "and I ate." In an astounding interpretation, the sages note that the verb is in the future tense, as if Adam was saying, "I ate and I will eat again." Miktav Eliyahu explains that Adam assessed himself objectively and said that if he were to be faced with a similar temptation, he would probably succumb again. A sinner cannot hope to escape from a spiritual squalor unless he is honest with himself. Now, the interesting thing about that is I did eat is what he says, but it's not really the future tense. It's in Hebrew there's a tense of an action that is not yet completed. So it's ongoing, but it has not yet been completed. So Adam is basically saying there when he eats the fruit, he's saying, "Yeah, I'm eating it and I'm going to keep eating it," right? It's kind of like we would say eating as opposed to ate. So he didn't say, "Yeah, I ate it." He said, "Yeah, I'm eating it," right? That's kind of the thing that's being expressed there by Adam. So it's not a remorse or a regret, and it's because of things like this in the text that you get rabbis. For example, there's Rabbi Manis Friedman, who's a Chabad rabbi, very ultra orthodox, who expresses that it actually isn't a sin that they ate the fruit in the garden. God wanted them to eat the fruit in the garden, according to Rabbi Manis Friedman. You can look him up on YouTube and get his view. It's an interesting view. It's certainly not a majority view, even in Judaism. But the idea there is basically that God created Adam and Eve and put them in the garden, which was kind of like, it wasn't really on earth. It was like a level in between heaven and earth, right? And he wanted them to go down to earth, but they had to choose to do so. And one of the things you'll notice in the text, God says to Adam, "In the day that you eat the fruit, you will surely die." So he doesn't say, "if you eat the fruit," right? He says, "Don't eat the fruit, because in the day that you eat it, you will surely die." And so Rabbi Manis Friedman makes a lot of hay with this issue. Say, hey, it says, basically God is telling him, you are going to eat the fruit, and in the day that you eat it, you're going to die, right? Because God, some might view that as God knows what choices that they're going to make, but the view that he's presenting there is that God actually wants them to eat the fruit so that they can then go down to earth and perfect the creation that God has made. All right. None of that's my views. Those are the views that have been expressed in Christianity and Judaism. I just wanted to throw them out there first. My view is not a religious view on the topic, because I think that in order to understand the topic, you have to view it in the lens of mythology, which, in my opinion, it clearly is. I know some people aren't going to like that view, but let's face it. We've got a garden with two trees with magical fruit. If you eat the one fruit, you die. You gain knowledge, but it leads to death. And if you eat the other fruit, you live forever. Right? It's pretty much mythology. I don't know. That's not my kid. Hey, father. I'm not a religious leader, by the way. Anyhow, it's clearly mythology, in my opinion. And so if we view this as mythology, then what we have to do is look at ancient mythology, because myths tend to share themes. So, for example, we have like vampire movies, right? And in vampire movies, if you hold up a cross, it's somehow a deterrent to the vampire. Why? I don't know. It just is, and everybody knows this when they're watching it. So when somebody holds up a cross, right, on a vampire movie, we all get the idea. We know what's happening there. Nobody has to explain. The narrator doesn't have to say, hey, they're holding up a cross because this scares off the vampires, right? So there are themes like that that you get, and when you write a vampire movie, you just include the crosses and the garlic and the silver bullets and the whole 9 yards, because this is part of the genre. And the same thing is true in mythology. When you're writing a myth, you're not just expressing your ideas, but you're using a vehicle that other people have used, and there are ideas that are native to the vehicle, right? And one of the myths that was very common back in ancient Mesopotamia, in the Near East, in the Levant, in this part of the world, was the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there are themes, and I just went ahead and I highlighted some of these on Kindle. You can get the Epic of Gilgamesh and read it yourself. It doesn't take that long to read. But the Epic of Gilgamesh has a lot of overlapping themes with the Adam and Eve story in Genesis 2. So basically, okay, so the overview of the Epic of Gilgamesh, it starts out in the city of Uruk, where Gilgamesh is the king. He's very proud of his city, but he's abusing some of the locals. So all of the locals, really, the people in his city. So they complain to the gods that Gilgamesh is being abusive to them. But the problem is Gilgamesh's mother is a goddess herself. So they go to one of the gods who created humans, and they ask her to create a human that is a second self for Gilgamesh, right? So she creates this human called Enkidu, a wild man. She puts him in this forest where he lives with the animals. The locals see him. He freaks them out. There's a naked wild man running around. So they go to Gilgamesh, the king, and they say, hey, out here in the country, we're having a problem. You need to handle it. So he tells them to take a temple prostitute out there. She lures Enkidu. He sleeps with her. This causes a change in him. Now the animals reject him. And he goes back to live in the city, and they set off on adventures together. And there's basically a search for immortality in this story. Gilgamesh is confronted when Enkidu dies. They kill a heavenly bull. Enkidu dies. He's mourning the death of his friend, and he wants to know how he can live forever. So that's the theme of the adventures they set on, is looking for eternal life, like eternal youth, to live forever. So what we get is, in the story, there are some things that carry directly over from one to the other. You're probably going to notice them. I'll point them out if you don't. But Anu heard them. He nodded his head. This from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Then to the goddess, mother of creation, he called out, Aruru, you are the one who created humans. Now go and create a double for Gilgamesh, right? A double, kind of like God's looking for the helper for Adam, right? The perfect helper. He says, now go create a double for Gilgamesh, his second self. This is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, right? A man who equals his strength and courage, a man who equals his stormy heart. Create a new hero. Let them balance each other perfectly. The perfect helper, right? So that Uruk has peace. When Aruru heard this, she closed her eyes, and what Anu had commanded she formed in her mind. She moistened her hands. She pinched off some clay. She threw it into the wilderness, kneaded it, shaped it to her idea, and fashioned a man. The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground, right? A warrior, a hero, Enkidu the brave, as powerful and fierce as the war god Ninurta. Then moving on in the story, he made his journey. He stood before Gilgamesh in the center of Uruk. He told him about the savage man. The king said, go to the temple of Ishtar, ask them for a woman named Shamhat, one of the priestesses, who give their bodies to any man in honor of the goddess. So he says, in order to deal with Enkidu, we got to civilize him. Let's send a woman out there, and it's a temple prostitute they send. He says, Take her into the wilderness when the animals are drinking at the water hole. Tell her to strip off her robe and lie there naked, ready with her legs apart. The wild man will approach. Let her use her love arts. Nature will take its course. And then the animals who knew him in the wilderness will be bewildered and will leave him forever. Right? So I will put enmity between the serpent and the woman. Right? So then it says, at last he stood up and walked towards the water hole to rejoin the animals. This is after Enkidu and what's her name again? Shamhat? Yeah, Enkidu and Shamhat do their little thing, right? She civilizes him. It says he stood up and walked toward the watering hole to rejoin the animals, but the gazelles saw him and scattered. The antelope and deer bounded away. So you have the enmity between the humans and the animals. He turned back to Shamhat. As he walked, he knew that in his mind he had somehow grown larger. He knew things now that an animal can't know. He gained the knowledge. Enkidu sat down at Shamhat's feet. He looked at her, and he understood all the words as she was speaking to him. Now, Enkidu, you know what it is to be with a woman, to unite with her. To be one, they will be as one, right? To unite with her. You are beautiful. You are like a god. Why should you roam the wilderness to live like an animal? So again, just like in the story we have in Genesis 2, where they eat the fruit, they gain knowledge, and God says, behold, the man has become like one of us. Enkidu has gained new knowledge. He has become like the gods. The animals reject him now. These are just some of the themes, by the way. There's a lot more than this. She leads him back to the city. I'm trying to see if there was anything else I needed in here. Yes, there is. If I can find it real quick. Okay. So in his search for immortality, it takes him to Utnapishtim, which, by the by, completely unrelated to this topic, Utnapishtim is the Noah of the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? He builds the boat to survive the flood, puts all the animals on it, and he's rewarded with immortality for having done this. But the Gilgamesh asks Utnapishtim, how do I gain immortality? You have it, I want it, how do I get it, right? So Utnapishtim tells him there's a plant at the bottom of the ocean. Gilgamesh goes to the bottom of the ocean, gets this plant, he's taking it back to his city of Uruk, and he stops to take a bath on the way, and a snake smelled its fragrance. Stealthily it crawled up and carried the plant away. As it disappeared, it cast off its skin. So the snake eats the fruit that allows him to live forever, so now he doesn't have it anymore, right? And notice the snake sheds its skin. And this is a theme in ancient literature. Like in Christianity, the serpent is Satan, of course. In Judaism, it's the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. But the serpent has always been seen. There's even in Exodus, there's a scene where the Israelites are being bit by snakes. God tells Moses to make a snake out of bronze and put it up, and they'll look to the snake to be saved. The snake has always been a symbol for medicine, even today with the pharmacies, right? You see the pharmacy, what's their sign? The snake wrapped around the pole, right? Because the snake has always been a sign of healing, of regenerating, because of the fact that the snake sheds its skin. So this is a bit of etiology in the Epic of Gilgamesh. What is the significance of the snake shedding its skin? He's staying young. Why is he staying young? Because he ate the fruit that allows you to live forever. So in both stories, we have a snake, a serpent, right? That is, some religions dance around with poisonous snakes. Yeah, absolutely. Like in Appalachia, Christianity does that, but and the funny thing is that actually comes from the long ending of Mark, which isn't even original to the text. But that aside, both stories, you have a serpent, you have a fruit that allows you to live forever, but yet the human is somehow screwed out of it by the serpent, right? The serpent keeps the human from accessing the fruit here by deception. In the biblical account, but in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he just steals it while he's taking his bath on the way back to the city. So my argument is that Genesis 2:4 through Genesis 11 is one solid myth, and that it's retelling the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's not stealing the story, right? just like a vampire movie isn't stealing the idea of a cross scaring off vampires or the garlic or the silver bullets. It's not. It's using the themes that are common in mythology of that day and retelling them. So in order to really fully understand the story, we have to understand the themes that are in there and what they mean in the other texts, and then we can take them to the Genesis story. Now, this is important because in the Genesis story, the woman is created after the man and from the man. I think my personal take on this, when you go to the Epic of Gilgamesh, what the theme of that story is that the city is great, right? Because Gilgamesh is looking for immortality, and what he finds is that humans cannot achieve immortality, but he has a sort of immortality of his own. Like the story starts and ends in the city of Uruk with a long description of his city, his great city that he's so proud of. So the conclusion of the epic is that you live on, Gilgamesh will live on in his city, the name of his city. And ironically enough, here we are. If Gilgamesh was a historical person, he lived 4,300 years ago, I believe it is. And I'm talking about him today, right? He does achieve that immortality. And this is anathema to the Genesis 2 creation story, to the Adam and Eve story, right? They have the exact opposite thing. So you'll see cities are always bad in the story, in the Genesis story, right? So after Cain kills Abel, first thing he does, starts a city, right? The myth ends at another city where the men are trying to create a name for themselves. And this is the big thing in this whole myth. It's about names. How do you create a name? And if you go to Genesis 11, you get the Tower of Babel. They say, let us make a name for ourselves. If you go to Genesis 6, when you get the sons of God come down to the daughters of men, and it'll read in the English translation something along the lines of, it'll say like, these were the men of old, men of renown, or the warriors of old, men of renown. The Hebrew actually says men of name. Right? This is all about making a name for yourself. How do you make a name for yourself? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, you make a name for yourself in a great city, whereas in the Genesis story, you make a name for yourself by having your children and living on the land that God gave you. And so this is the overarching theme of the two myths. In the Genesis myth, this is a myth about having a family in the land that God gave you. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's about making a name for yourself in the city, because these are the early civilizations. They're very proud of their cities, right? So the problem is we read the Genesis, the Adam and Eve story as if it's somehow historical and as if these are the first two humans, when everything in the story itself would tell you they're not. So Cain kills Abel. We should have 3 people on the planet, but somehow Cain instantly takes a wife and goes off and builds a city. How does he build a city? Right? There's nobody there to live in the city. There's nobody there to build a city, even if you wanted to. Like, that takes a lot of manpower without any industrial equipment, right? Obviously, there are other people at the time. Just like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Enkidu is created, there's a whole city over here. There's people living out in the village, right? He's just in a woods by himself, just like Adam and Eve are in the garden by themselves. Now, in the story, I would argue that Adam is Enkidu, right? He's the man that is created. Adam is Enkidu. But Eve is not Gilgamesh, who is Eve. She's more or less the temple prostitute. She's the one there to civilize Adam, to bring Adam out of the garden into the world around him. But in this story, it's a bad thing, not a good thing, right? You don't want to go. You want to live on the land that God gave you. It is death to lose the land that God gave you. So in the day you eat of it, you will die. We ask today, because we read it as a literal historical document, right? So we ask today, well, they didn't die the day they ate the fruit. Did God lie? Well, no, God didn't lie. That's in this myth. Death is to lose the land that God gave you. And you see the same thing at the end of Deuteronomy 29, when Moses goes through or it might be 32, when Moses goes through the blessings and the curses, right? He says, if you do what God said, he says, I place before you a choice, life and good, death and evil, which takes us right back to the garden. Tree of life, tree of good and evil. Right? I place before you these choices, but life isn't eternal life, it's living on the land that God gave you. And death isn't physical death, it's losing the land God gave you. It's living in exile, right? And so this is the theme of the myth, and it's realized by other authors who are writing, and I don't believe there's one author of the whole Torah, so it's realized by other authors who are writing at the same time. So that leads us back to the question, why is the man created first and the woman created second and taken from his body, right? And the answer is because when you read what is a beautiful love poem, and we tend to take the love poem out of it by reading a commandment into it. But if you go to Genesis 2, after Adam is created and Eve is brought to him, he says, let me find the verse here. He says, then the man said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, it doesn't say shall in the Hebrew. When you read the Hebrew, there's no command here, right? So reading it in the Hebrew, basically what it says is, then the man said, this time is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore, for this reason, a man leaves his father and mother and holds fast to his wife, and they become one flesh. So, because the theme of this myth is that you live by living in the land God gave you and passing it down to your children, and then they live in that land, and that's how you build a name through your future generations who are living in the land that God gave you. So in this myth, the woman is created not from the rib, that's a bad translation, it's from the side of Adam. So if you notice in the story, when Eve eats the fruit, as we discussed from what the rabbis believe, when Eve eats the fruit, she's punished, even though she wasn't told to eat the fruit, but she kind of was told to eat the fruit in their view because it's his other side. So Adam's one person, right, who is split in two to make Adam and Eve in this story, because that brings them back together as one flesh at the end. And how are they one flesh at the end? Through the children that they have. The man joins to his woman and they become one flesh in the child that they have. That child then lives on the land that God gave them as their inheritance, right? And that's how you gain your name. That's how you gain eternal life. So at the Tower of Babel, they want to build a city to make a name. And then immediately after the Tower of Babel, you're introduced to Abraham, who does what? He marries a barren woman. So he's giving up his chance at a name. So you get these contrasts in the Torah, especially in the Abraham stories. You're always presented with these stark contrasts. You got these men who are building a tower into the heavens, which people, another misinterpretation is that they're building this tower to get up to the gods. No, they're building the tower so that they can't be destroyed with a flood again, right? They believe in this flood that wiped everybody out. The point of the tower is to build a tower high enough to where they can get above the flood waters if another one were to come. They want, again, immortality. We want to be able to survive if God tries to wipe out the earth. Well, Abraham sacrificed it. He doesn't want to make a name for himself. He's not worried about making a name for himself. He's worried about taking care of this woman who's barren. So nobody wants to, she can't have children. Nobody wants to marry her. Abraham says, I will take her. I will care for her instead of trying to make a name for myself, right? So you get a lot of these comparisons like that in the Torah, but this whole Adam and Eve story is about making a name. How do you make a name? You make a name by two becoming one in the form of their children and living on and farming the land God gave them. And it's actually a beautifully well-crafted story if you recognize what's going on in the story, because when you go on to Genesis 3, right, or Genesis 4, I believe, after they eat the fruit, what happens? They get kicked out of the garden, and they were hunter-gatherers in the garden, right? God put all these fruit trees there, and they're hunter-gatherers. Well, then they have two sons. One is a shepherd, the other one is a farmer, grows the fruit, right? So they go from hunter-gatherer to farm life, right? Subsistence farming. And within a few verses, Cain kills Abel, and now he goes and builds a city. So you get this story of the development of humans from hunter-gatherer to subsistence farmer to building cities, and it all happens in like 10 verses. Like, it's a beautifully written myth. Let's call it what it is. It's a myth. And it's a beautifully written myth. But I don't mean it's a myth as in there's nothing to, don't worry about it, there's nothing to learn from it. There is a lot to learn from it. I'm not on here to push any religious view, so whatever religious view you take from it, that's up to you. Pick one, whatever you like. But I recognize the beauty in the text, and I like for other people to recognize it as well. So I was very happy when I got this question about the woman in the garden and what's the significance of Adam being created first. Did she sin first? Now, did she sin at all? In my view, no, she didn't. Like, this is part of the point of the story. If they didn't eat the fruit, there'd be no story, right? Whereas if you look at it as historical, if they didn't eat the fruit, then that's a great thing. They live forever in the garden, apparently. I don't know. But there is a mythology that's driving the text. So they have to eat the fruit. She's not doing a bad thing there. The whole point of the woman is to civilize a man, to bring him out of the garden, out of the hunter-gatherer mode into the subsistence farmer mode, and they have to go there because that's what we're telling in the story is the progression of humanity. So it really has to happen. Let me see if there were any questions in there because I've kind of been ignoring it. We got a hello from Russia. That makes sense. Spliced. Yeah, really spliced. I like that you're thorough because not only is there a different books, but there's different interpretations of each. But some people are literal, some people are learning by the story. Yeah, that's the thing, you know. We get a really good idea of where the authors of this particular text, and I might do some more lives on the documentary hypothesis, the different sources that come together to make the Torah. This particular author here of this particular mythology, you get a good idea of where they think you're coming from, because when you compare Genesis 1 and 2, they're completely different creation stories. They're not even similar, right? Genesis 1 is this top-down God from above, and he's speaking things into existence. He doesn't get his hands dirty, right? Whereas in Genesis 2, you have a God who's on earth, forming man from the ground. He's walking in the garden with the humans. And so the Genesis 1 is the priestly account. They have this very high view of God, whereas the Genesis 2 account is the Elohist, and they are much more casual in there. I don't want to say casual. Like they obviously view God as supreme, but God is much more like us, is a good way to put it, in their creation account. So when we want to make something, we get the dirt, mix the water, we make the clay, we form it with our hands. And so that's how God made us, right? Even when God walks in the garden with them in the story, he waits until the cool of the day. Like we don't have to go out and walk at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the sun's beating on us. Wait till there's some shade. The cool of the day, we go for a walk in the garden. That's what God does too. So I really like the view of God presented here. It's a God who's a lot like us. He's just bigger and more powerful than us, right? But he does things the same way we do, and you can relate to that God better. Now, some people need the God that's up above and yelling down commands, right? I relate better to the God of Genesis 2. So anyway, I appreciate the question. If anybody watching, if you have questions that you want to ask me, you can PM them to me, you can leave them on a video, or you can make a video and tag me in it, whatever the case may be. But I, of course, am not a scholar. I'm just a guy who, look, I'm a truck driver, okay? And so I have Audible. I do a lot of the audiobooks on this stuff. I have Kindle. I read a lot of the scholarship on this stuff because I do want to come to an understanding of it. And what I come to, I'll share with you, and you can take it or leave it. So if you have a question, you can send me, follow me. I try to follow people back when they do. And you can send me the question or tag me in a video, whatever the case may be. But thank you for this question, and I hope the answer was helpful. I'm going to go ahead and jump off of here and watch some football.